I'm very excited for our panel today, but I will just introduce our wonderful moderator, Tim Daly. He's the Director of Gun Violence Prevention and Justice Reform at the Joyce Foundation. No stranger to the space. Welcome.
Thank you, Nick. And it's so great to see everybody. For those that I have not met, as Nick said, my name is Tim Daly. I'm the Director of the Gun Violence Prevention and Justice Reform Program based in Chicago, Illinois. I also am pleased to serve as the chair of a donor collaborative called the Fund for a Safer Future. And my colleague, Talia Rivera, is here in the back of the room. Hello, Talia. Thanks for being here. And it's great to be here. It's great to be here for a few reasons. And I'll just take a quick point of personal privilege. I used to work here at the Center for American Progress, and I worked here from 2014 to 2016. And myself and a couple of my colleagues at the time, Chelsea Parsons and Eugenio Weigland and others, we helped organize the first version of this meeting. And so it's great to be back here. I've been back here many times since, but to be back here today on the 10th edition of this event. So congratulations to Nick and the team at the center, including Billy and Marlene and everybody who has spent a tremendous amount of time and energy to make these events so successful. So thank you to all of you. So just a quick word of background. Today, we are going to talk a little bit about state, local, and federal offices of violence prevention and how those offices are being utilized to reduce gun violence in our communities. This, as you know, is a fairly modern innovation and has happened at different speeds at different places across the country. And so today we're going to try and unpack as much of that as we can with a tremendous panel of folks whom we'll introduce now. To my right is Will Pickney Jr. Will is the director of the Office of Violence Prevention for the city of St. Louis, Missouri. And to his right is Heather Warnken, who is the executive director for the Center for Criminal Justice Reform at the University of Baltimore. So just a little bit more about each of them, if I may. Will here has spent more than 35 years in the criminal justice sector, promoting safety, education, policy development, and training. And as I mentioned, he's currently working in St. Louis, where he's providing strategic direction and oversight for the city of St. Louis's efforts to create safe and healthy neighborhoods free of violence. Before he served in this role, he also served as the director of the Mayor's Office of Children, Youth, and Families for the city of St. Louis. And before that, served 20 plus years as a member of the New York City Police Department and is a founder and CEO of a management and consulting firm. Heather, since 2022, has served as the inaugural executive director for the Center for Criminal Justice Reform at the University of Baltimore. For those that are less familiar, the center supports community-driven efforts to improve public safety and to address the harm and inequity caused by the criminal legal system. Prior to joining the university, she worked at both the U.S. Department of Justice, where she spent time working across federal, state, and local stakeholders, working on many of the issues that we're going to be talking about today, and also served at the Warren Institute at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. So with that, let's jump into it. The Office of Violence Prevention. Before we talk about the offices themselves, I'm curious to hear both of your all's perspective on, well, what are the problems that people are trying to solve with this idea of the office? What is the issue at the core of the Office of Violence Prevention? So, Will, maybe we'll start with you.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you for having me. This is an important conversation. In St. Louis, I could talk about the problems were coordination. Mike Brown was killed in 2014 in St. Louis, so it was sort of the ground zero of criminal justice reform. There had been numerous studies and analysis done prior to that. We had the Ferguson Commission report. We had the For Sake of All report that was written by Dr. Jason Pinnell, which talked about the conditions for Black families and Black individuals in the region. You had the Equity Indicators report. So you had the solutions, right? You had what people had done, very broad cross sections of people, including people in communities that were impacted, coming together saying, this is what needs to happen to change the narrative. So one of the challenges is, how do you take all of that? Because people come in, they do that analysis, they lead these organizations, they find them, and then because they're talented, because they're rooted in those communities, because they have knowledge, they're gone. Right? They get other positions that are helping them to get into the fight and to, achieve outcomes. So you just never really have a point where you stop and say, let's look at this, because now a new leader is going to come in and want to do their own analysis, want to do their own research. and it doesn't help for action, right? And people are tired of studies, analysis, and they want action, right? So you need to have a place and a coordinating body that can help to make sure that action takes place. So you're trying to solve for that problem. And I think that's most important. Obviously, crime and violence, ebbs and flows, and it was on the incline. So you're trying to obviously solve for those problems of, gunshots and homicides. And then you're trying to deal with the historical inequities and disinvestment in communities, right? So all those things play together. There are nuanced challenges there, but that's really what you're trying to solve for.
Yeah, thanks, Will. And Heather, you, as I mentioned, when you were at the Department of Justice, you were working with a number of these stakeholders, and then you were also working with the coalition to create a statewide office in Maryland. Can you speak to the same question?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to start by saying how honored I am to be here and be a part of this conversation. And when I talk about this very hopeful and exciting development of this brand new passage of a statewide OVP in Maryland, what a beautiful coalition-driven effort this was. So as the Center for Criminal Justice Reform, we were proud to be one member of the Maryland Violence Prevention Coalition, which includes over 80 community members representing community violence intervention, public health, social services, racial equity advocates, academics coming together around the same table to build solutions. It's co-led by Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence and Community Justice. And so a big shout out to their leadership. So again, I'm honored to kind of channel what was this incredible group effort to get this done. I would say ditto to a lot of what Will already said about the problems, and also this sort of meta problem that we actually have a lot of assets and a lot of incredible resources to bring to bear, but not a lot of coordination to really leverage them and put those pieces together. And so I think this was crescendoing for us in Maryland, and I would say a very pivotal moment that laid bare these problems and the urgency of doing something together to solve it was the devastating mass shooting at Brooklyn homes. I think for many of us who were impacted by that, who participated in the direct response to that, it was a moment where we really reached out to the Moore administration. Governor Wes Moore was then at the helm to really use this as a convening opportunity to be more strategic about where we would head. And so the coalition came together and made 3 priority recommendations. Number 1, we need to launch a statewide OVP. It was great timing because there were about 7 OVPs at the time. So we had sort of a proof of concept out there. We could point to this exciting strategy, but it was also new and exciting. We were learning from those and we were forging a new path of what that could be in Maryland. Number 2, through that new OVP that we would stand up, conduct a public health needs assessment to look statewide at what are the existing assets and what do we need to do to grow this infrastructure. And number 3, increase funding for community-based violence intervention programs. Maryland had about a $3 million investment at the time, nowhere near commensurate with the problem. And to the administration's credit, they said, let's go on all 3.
That's great. And thank you. And you had mentioned that at the time, there was about 7 of these state offices. Now there is in the neighborhood of 12, 13, 14-ish. So definitely a growth. And at the city level, I mean, there was just a handful. You were just at the national OVP network. How many cities were at that meeting?
I think about 40, a little around 40, 48 cities were represented. I think there's about 60 formal OVPs in the country now. And I think 40 of them have been created since 2020. So,
wow.
It's really a growing and an important approach to public safety.
Yeah, thank you. So of those, not all of those offices are the same. Some were created in statute, ordinance, executive order. Some are just announcements. When they are set up, they're set up in different places. They may be funded at different levels. Can you speak a little bit from your experiences of what have been the traits, either in your office or from your observation of other offices, that have set those offices up for success? And Heather, maybe we'll start with you, if that's okay.
Sure. One of the really important pieces of this advocacy, and which so many of the stakeholders were really in lockstep on, was the need to place this in the health department, to bring a public health approach to this, to really help right size the state's approach to violence reduction. And, sort of it was clear in the hearings in the House and Senate, throughout the advocacy to pass the bill, there was a lot of reactions and a lot of kind of muscle memory of the system to try to claw it back, into the public safety agencies. But it was really about this continued advocacy of why it was such an important focus to put it in the health department, not to the exclusion of those. But the fact that we had that public safety infrastructure, the way that this new office could work with the governor's office of crime prevention and policy to coordinate with law enforcement and the criminal legal response that already existed. And this was such a big part, why a Center for Criminal Justice Reform and so many criminal legal reform advocates were at the table for this effort. That, and a lot of work that we do to address the harm and inequity and stop doing things in the public safety realm that are actually causing harm for communities and are actually undermining our violence reduction efforts. What are we going to do to build up something different? What are we going to do to reimagine safety, make the investments, build that infrastructure? So we're like, this is about marrying the public safety and public health assets that we already have. There was also a lot in this advocacy that was about clearing up sort of misconceptions of what that meant. And I think there were some really powerful conversations yesterday speaking to this, including the plenary panel at the end of the day with our Secretary of Health, Secretary Herrera Scott, talking about what it means. This isn't just about health. A public health approach is bringing a different approach to the problem of how we diagnose it, how we look at the continuum of care to respond to it. And there was a lot of dispelling of myths about what that meant, in these Senate and House hearings, and how this wasn't about sort of replacing the public safety assets that we have. This was about working together to think about the problem and how to solve it differently.
Bill?
Yeah, so my office was created by ordinance, which I think is really important because it is now institutionalized within the government within the city of St. Louis. So I had to create that office, which was a challenge because there is no cheat sheet. There was no, roadmap to doing that. I am in the Department of Public Safety, and I do think this is where it's a place for an important conversation, because to your question, I think the most important piece is leadership, right? When you create these offices in a city, in a county, in a state, you want to have the right leadership. And I think that's more important in a sense than where it is, because the public health approach is a process more than a place. And depending on the mechanics and the situation in the city you're in, is going to dictate whether that can happen. So some of the work was in the health department in the city of St. Louis, but the health department was underfunded and undersized and didn't have the expertise. And so I'm very close with the health director there, Dr. Mahdi. She's doing great work. And she felt like it was better to be in my office in the Department of Public Safety because we had that expertise, right? So I think that you really have to think about where it makes the most sense for where you are. I don't want us to get into this like zero-sum game, right? Of it has to be here or it has to be there. So I think that's most important in setting up an office. And then it's really just about thinking about what you have on the ground in terms of the work being done, and changing the narrative around what public safety is. We just had a conversation. We're doing this process of developing a logo, and we brought together some young people to really help us do that. And we brought together an illustrator and just had a conversation with them and asked them what was something they thought about when they heard Office of Violence Prevention. And some of them said police. And so we have to change the narrative around what public safety means, because public safety isn't police. Violence prevention isn't police. Those things are about communities and about how people feel safe and are safe and what you need to do to keep people safe. And then also about accountability. There's many ways to hold people accountable, right? And law enforcement and arrest is just one piece of that, but it's not the only way. So those are some things we need to change as we think about how to set offices up for success.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you mentioned, both of you, where these offices are located. I just want to make one plug to a recent report that the Joyce Foundation came out with this past July. We commissioned a landscape analysis of the statewide offices of gun violence prevention. At the time, there was 12. I'm happy to report that this report is already out of date. The legislature in California has already enacted a new office. Pennsylvania, as you heard yesterday, now has recreated an office. So the report is slightly out of date. But what the report does do, I think, goes into one of the questions that you just points that you just mentioned, Will, which is that the local distinctions matter. Right? Different agencies, different cities, different states have different factors on the ground that they have to tailor these offices to. And when we put together this report, of those 12 states, about a third of them, interestingly enough, created these offices in their health department, as you mentioned. Another third or thereabouts had created it in their equivalent of like the state police or Department of Public Safety. And yet another third, if you will, created them elsewhere. Some were at their state administrating agency, the state agency responsible for getting federal grants, for example. And in Washington state, that meant the Department of Commerce, of all places. But the point being is it's so locally specific, and it has to be in order to be successful, is what I'm hearing you both say. Will, you mentioned the importance of leadership. I want to focus on that for a second. I think, Rob Wilcox and Greg Jackson, whom are here in spirit, I'm sure everybody is always actively engaged with them. And I think Greg is everywhere, so I'm sure he is somewhere here. They always talk about the proximity to the executive leadership, the president of the United States, the vice president of the United States, the mandate that they have bestowed on that office to just get, if Bob Kramer was up here, he would say, get S done. I'll say get stuff done. But that mandate is critical. Can you speak a little bit more about that leadership component? Like, how important is that mandate, and how do you leverage that in St. Louis?
Yeah, I mean, you have to have buy-in and leadership from your mayor, your governor, your county executive, whoever that chief principal is, because then the people leading these offices have that borrowed authority. Hopefully they have credibility and trust, which is really important as well. But you need that proximity. And I think anybody here, I see a lot of people around to do the work. If you're in a city, in a space where that leader is not vested completely and isn't a champion, it's a struggle. Because then you don't have the collaboration, then the police aren't sharing data, the health systems aren't sharing data, people aren't showing up for meetings, community organizations are fighting, they're going around the back of the director, out to the city council, to the board of aldermen. It's just a setup for disaster. So you really need to have as few layers between you and that chief executive as possible when you're leading these offices. I can speak to the mayor directly and the chief of staff and all of those things, because Mayor Jones, who's done a great work and whose leadership under which this office was created, is very vested in the work. And she goes out there and she speaks about it all the time. And she, which is amazing, right? So you got to be in close proximity.
How do you think about that question?
Yeah, again, I would say ditto. I mean, even though the strategy was so focused on making sure this was designed with a public health approach in mind, and through the direct leadership of the health department in coordination with the rest of the government, we wanted to keep it as close to the sun as possible. And it was so huge that the governor himself really took this on and championed this. So Wes Moore in this last session had 3 public safety bills in his package, and this was one of them. And you heard, the governor speaking directly to this. One of the others, which was profoundly related, actually, was the governor took on, again, with a very overlapping, huge, diverse coalition, a transformative bill to completely overhaul crime victim compensation in the state of Maryland in so many critical ways, including sort of untethering it from the criminal justice system and building it up as the health and healing program that it more effectively could be, in part because survivors of gun violence, in particular Black and Brown victims of gun violence, were not accessing this program. So again, to have that leadership at the top that really understood where we were headed, made all of the difference in getting this passed. And I think it will continue to make the difference in setting this up for success and the uphill climb of getting it properly funded in the months and years ahead, especially in the kind of fiscal climate and narrative around that we're in.
Thank you. We're going to talk about funding in just a minute, but let's go back to the convening role that these offices could have. And Heather, you talked a bit about, or your experience at the Department of Justice was really nested in bringing together these different stakeholders. Can you talk a bit about how you envision this office here in Maryland being able to leverage that convening role and what could come of that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's so many different ways that having this office at the state level and with this particular approach to collaboration can be a game changer in terms of convening. But one point that I want to lift up that our secretary lifted up yesterday that I think so key about that is making it easier for grassroots organizations and community partners to actually come to the table and partner with government. And that means, removing red tape around, disseminating grant funds, administering grant funds, removing red tape and bureaucratic morass around, partnering on data sharing agreements, really creating a table that these offices can set that make it clear we're not trying to tell community what to do, but rather we want to come together. We want to lift up resources, including the data we've collected and analyzed, and have you tell us and respond what you think that means in terms of how we can support you moving forward. So I love that piece. Again, kind of weaving together the complex process of looking at state, local, and national data, accessing what is often inaccessible data, and building that up so that we can be smarter and more strategic about the limited resources that we have. And then lastly, I'll just lift up again the way that the state, local, and hyper-local, like community neighborhood level partners need to come together to kind of unsilo this work and look at trends and recognize how much these issues can vary. I thought it was so interesting that the secretary shared in some of their very initial data analysis efforts out of the new OVP, the different geographic trends that they were seeing, that in Western Maryland and the Eastern Shore, more of a suicide challenge to confront, whereas in some of the big cities and in Baltimore, even though we've got some amazing declines to celebrate, still more a homicide and non-fatal shooting focus, that in Prince George's County, the data was showing more women on women violence. And what are the implications of that for our local customized response?
Yeah. Will, can you offer any examples of how you've leveraged your office to convene stakeholders in the city or in the community?
Sure. So every 2 weeks, we convene all of the funded partners we have and the non-funded partners to talk about what's going on the ground, right? Because I think when you talk about convening is what do you say when you get people in the room? And that's really important because you have to really keep focus on the strategic direction, right? In doing this work, in my office, and I think in many, you're focusing specifically on people who are actively engaged in violence, people who have been shot, and people who are at high risk of being shot. And anybody in this room probably knows as you're dealing with community organizations, they often want to go where they want to go, right? And you have to really keep focused because consistency is important in any approach to, public safety and really important in this one. So we convene those people. We've convened reentry organizations around what were gaps and challenges in serving people and their families who are returning from incarceration. We just did a focus group recently because out of that convening came some discussions about how do you support families of people returning from incarceration. And it's something that hasn't really been happening in St. Louis, and I don't know of other places, but we're going to start these family support meetings, right? So we convene people there. We convene behavioral health partners, right? And not only do we convene people, but I make sure we're in convenings because this work is about drawing threads between what is going on already, right? We don't want to create a new meeting and to convene people when there's a meeting that already taken place that we can become a part of. So convening people in the behavioral health space around crisis intervention and trauma, convening hospital partners around how are we engaging people who are have severe mental health issues and are, in crisis. And what do we do when they're in crisis to keep them safe and people around them safe? Convening young people who serve young people and to think about how do we create safe spaces? How do we bring in influencers to lift up what is already happening so youth can join that? But then how can we also support the facilitation, creation of events so that we can have young people joining, be safe. So there's all kinds of convening going on, whether you're convening as an OVP yourself because you're able to bring people to the table because you're a neutral partner and a neutral convener, or whether you're taking part in it to understand what's going on so we're not reinventing the wheel.
Thank you both for those answers. I'll say when we did that report that I mentioned earlier this summer, we subsequently then convened ourselves, all of the state OVPs, to just have a kind of a discussion of best practices and learned experience in the sort. One of the things that really struck us is that, a lot of these offices, you're only one or two people, right? Sometimes more, sometimes even less, gosh sakes. But what's interesting is that at the state level, at least, there's a number of assets that are focused on preventing gun violence. Maybe in the Department of Health already there's some data collection underway, or maybe at the state administrating agency, they're getting grant funding from the feds to do some program. But given the limitations of government, oftentimes these entities are completely siloed, perhaps even unaware of each other. And so what we found in pulling together this report was just how important it was to just put all these folks in the same room. And but for that office doing it, they would not be in the same room. I don't know if that's been your experience too, Heather, and what you've seen. Like, have you seen that where even going back to your DOJ days where, these silos exist within government and you like, how do they break those silos?
Yeah, it's so hard because oftentimes it's not like we need more meetings. Sometimes it's like meeting fatigue, but are we actually convening them in the right way? And I think, especially for example, in violence reduction work, the complex relationship with information sharing across the criminal justice system and law enforcement and community-based efforts, and sometimes the information only needing to flow, one way for very strategic reasons. When I was still at DOJ, I had the great privilege of leading a citywide assessment in Baltimore on the response to victims of violence. And this was, we produced about a 90-page, pretty harrowing report full of findings about all the ways that not only were victims of violent crime, in particular Black victims of gun violence, who were more likely to be criminalized than seen and served as survivors, but all the ways that the system was breaking down because of that lack of coordination. And we produced 21 recommendations in that report. And now the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement to this day convenes a regular meeting, bringing together the HVIPs, Community Violence Intervention Programs, community and criminal justice system-based victim services, and other relevant stakeholders, coming together around the same table to try to take on one by one the recommendations of this report and how can we advance it. And now we have the opportunity with the state OVP to think about the implications and pieces of this that are not just specific to Baltimore, that we could be thinking about on a statewide level.
Yeah. Let me press a little bit further on that piece, because you also spoke to another issue that I think has come up around these offices of violence prevention, especially at the city level. A lot of it is community violence intervention related or community specific. At the state level, there are broader questions. Can you just say, when you all and your partners, whom you so gratefully outlined at the outset there, because there were so many people involved in this effort to bring about this office in Maryland. Can you speak a little bit about the breadth of the scope or the issues that the office was designed to address?
Yeah, I think it was intentionally very broad because what we're missing is sort of that convening level that can put the different pieces together. Of course, on the flip side of that is the challenge of kind of mission creep and having it be a little bit overwhelming. But I think especially at a state level office, they really have the ability to really understand how we can work better at the intersections of these siloed areas of, for example, gun crime, gun violence related to homicide and non-fatal shootings and suicide, community violence and the domestic violence, sexual assault space where gun violence is an issue. I mean, there's so many areas and worlds that are deeply and profoundly interconnected, but that we often separate. I think from where I sit in criminal legal reform, I think we talk a lot about the importance of bringing together a public safety and public health approach. And the governor says all the time, we've got to take this all of the above approach. I don't think we talk openly and honestly enough and work enough at the intersections about the things we are getting wrong in the public safety realm that are undermining our violence reduction efforts. And even in spaces like this, I often don't see a lot of my colleagues in criminal justice reform in the same spaces of gun violence prevention and vice versa. And we have not only a lot of opportunity of common ground, but we also have some really hard tensions to work through. Like, our response to gun violence will not work without systemic legitimacy. And there are very serious threats to systemic legitimacy that the criminal justice reform space is trying to take on, and racial equity. There are also really uncomfortable realities about racist and disparate enforcement on gun laws. And we don't want to create tensions. We want to create allies across people that are working for common ground. So I see an opportunity with statewide OVPs to really step up and set tables where we can have those hard conversations.
That's great. Thank you for that. And Will, I did you dirty. I shouldn't have said you work just on community violence intervention, because as I was listening to Heather, I'm remembering you talking about how you've engaged also like the and alternative response, efforts in the city, and you've also leveraged even some of the community policing work. Can you just speak a little bit more about that in terms of like how you fold all those things together?
Yeah, sure. And I think it comes down to, this is a block by block fight. You have to be in community. You have to be in the places in community where violence is most prevalent in your city every day. And that's where you're going to find the answers. That's where you're going to understand what needs to be done, to your point about, this isn't just about CVI and CVI in the sense of violence interruption programs. Yeah, we fund that. But we also fund reentry work. We also fund youth diversion work, where we're trying to engage youth who have been engaged by the system. We also do preventative youth programming. We also do crisis intervention work. We have a co-responder program. We have a call diversion program. We have a community center response that doesn't involve police. We fund organizations that do provide counseling. We fund organizations that deal with domestic violence survivors. But you only really understand what needs to be done in a comprehensive, holistic way. We talk about root causes, right? And addressing root causes. We talk about public health approaches, right? And this is going to sound maybe somewhat corny, but you got to move from rhetoric to results, and you got to move from agenda setting to action. People are tired of hearing all that in community. How do you develop legitimacy and trust? By being in community every day, not when something happens, but just being there. And the first time you're there, somebody's looking at you like, who are you? What you doing? All of a sudden they find out you're bringing information, you're raising awareness. This is free. You can come and get information and food and hear music and all of that stuff. Or we do peace marches in St. Louis. We were actually marching around talking about peace and rallying everybody and recognizing those impacted by violence. And nobody got shot. Like, we're not just here because, God forbid, the 12-year-old got shot and now we want to come and everybody's outraged. That's how you do it. And it has to be broad and comprehensive. And when you do that, you develop all the other stuff. Then it's easy to convene people. Then you have champions. It's not easy work now. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying like every day is, rainbows and unicorns, because it's not. But that is what this work is about. And that's why it has to be broader than that. And yeah, there's this tension between law enforcement and police and community violence intervention work and OVPs. Police are a part of public safety. That's not changing anytime soon. That doesn't mean they have to be the predominant actor. That doesn't mean we have to rely on them. I'm a former cop. I did bail reform in St. Louis, and I've done an OVP. I understand what's going on. And I understand it because I grew up in communities. I grew up in the projects in the Bronx. But I was also a 22-year-old who joined the police force. And the day that we got our gun and shield, one of the people in my class went home and killed herself. I was the same person that one of the first calls I went on was a double homicide of a young woman and a young man that was done by a 14-year-old. I'm the same person that, got really close to a young woman who was working like myself as a police officer and her partner at the time, and had to realize and miss her because he went home, or they went in her house together, and he killed her and then killed himself. So anybody that grows up in communities, in inner city communities, rural communities where there's disinvestment and all that, we all have trauma. I have trauma from that stuff. Like, you don't realize it in the moment. I'm a tough guy. I can show you everything that shows like this guy doesn't care about any of this. Of course I do. It's inside. And that just what drives me to do what I do. So, this is what we need. We need that passion. We need to understand what the landscape is, and we can't get caught up in, what is happening on the ground in a local OVP. Like, I can't get caught up in what the gun laws are in Missouri and what's happening with the police and what do people think about all that block by block. Every day when someone gets killed, we had a quadruple shooting with 3 people dead. That's what matters. And what can I do in that moment to deal with that situation? So hopefully, I
Yeah,
answered your
no,
question.
thank you. Thank you for that. We are running short on time. We want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience. So one more question from me before we transition, which is we've talked, as you said, the rainbows and the unicorns. Is that what you said about the thing? But it's not that. There are challenges to this approach. There are obstacles. Some of those are funding. Some of those are structural. That government doesn't always operate well. Can you both speak to what you view as the key obstacles that your offices or the offices you help create, how you've tried to do, what those are and how you've tried to address them? We'll start with you and then Heather will finish.
We don't have a deep enough bench. We don't have enough organizations committed to doing this work and serving people who are actively involved in gun violence, active shooters. I'll go back to that. Those organizations that do exist don't have enough people that are able to do that work. And there's not enough focus on the wellness of the people doing that work in those organizations. That's the biggest challenge.
I mentioned this before, and we'll double down on the funding challenge and really investing to set this new office up for success. The initial kind of ask was more in the realm of $10 million. By the time it got over the finish line, more like $2 million. So we have a long way to go, especially in this kind of fiscal narrative climate, that things that have a big fiscal note are going to be kind of dead on arrival in the next legislative session. Really building the case for why it is actually cost effective to invest in this work in a meaningful way, because unaddressed trauma and all the things we are getting wrong have a much bigger price tag. So I think that we've posted for the executive director position, some of the research position, and I think building up the different arms of this new OVP through the grants administration project. I think there's a lot of advocacy ahead. And one other point that I want to mention about what a challenge I think lies ahead is, I think one of the most important things that these offices do, as we've been talking about, is really this coordination, the bringing people together, the better situational awareness of what the landscape looks like across the state. That's actually really hard to measure. And yet, the legislators in Annapolis that made the decision about whether to pass the bill in the first place, that'll make decisions about how to fund it, they want to see metrics that show me what you're doing is working. And I think we need to be more creative and more holistic and more community driven about what those numbers that we put on the table look like, because it's not just reduction in crime rates, especially because we know, so much victimization and trauma goes unreported to systems and is hard to measure. So I want to think more for the future about how we demonstrate our success through that lens.
Great. Thank you both. We have a little bit of time for questions for those that might have them. Our friend Billy here will help us. Do you want them to come to you, or what do you prefer?
No, I'll walk around.
Okay, great. Well, let's start right here in the front. We'll go here first, and then Jeremy will come to you second.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this panel. This has been fantastic. So just very quick questions for each of you that are specific. So first, Wilford, some of our most effective investments are going to be in things like streetlights, in parks, right? In things that are going to require government action at the local level. And so I know that a big function of your office has been to fund community-based organizations that are doing the amazing work you were describing. Curious how you interact with government agencies that have a role to play in making those sorts of infrastructure investments in the community. And then Heather, loved what you were saying about the intersection of the criminal legal advocacy space and this gun violence prevention space. I come out of the criminal legal advocacy space, to be clear. Interested in the thinking around the violence prevention frame as opposed to a slightly broader community safety frame, if the goal was to marry those movements together, in part because I think there are functions, even like the alternative crisis response, alternative approaches to traffic enforcement, that wouldn't classically be thought of necessarily as violence prevention, but are certainly a part, I think, of that broader reimagining of safety through that kind of intersectional frame.
Great questions. You want to go first?
Sure. So I work really well with other government agencies. This goes back to the mayor being connected to the work and being a champion of the work. We have regular cabinet meetings where I interact with people. This goes back to people, right? So it's about relationships. And I'll just add that we also fund something called a public safety collaborative, which is a meeting of community members who look at infrastructure. And, so they're looking at places where there's high volume of crime and looking at infrastructure related causes for that, right? Vacant buildings, street lights and all of those things. So that's another way in which through that work, which is coming from community, which is driven by data. So they get data directly from the police department. That helps highlight where there needs to be better collaboration between my office and those other city agencies.
Can you just say one more thing to that question? Because we talked earlier about proximity, right? And you having the authority of the mayor to do something. You mentioned then in the answer to that question, being in that cabinet meeting, right? Can you just say, like, I'm presuming that that cabinet official recognizing that you are acting on behalf of the mayor, like, matters, right? Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it does. And so that cabinet meetings is all the department heads and the mayor and her staff and all of that, right? And so you're meeting for a variety of reasons. But yeah, it is really important to run, number one, let them know what's going on with my office and what we're seeing, because they're all busy every day and doing whatever they do, right? And so everybody's sort of got blinders on. But that's also where you get to develop relationships, right? Because they may do it because I call up and they know the mayor cares about this, but they're going to do it even quicker if I call up and as well, and we have a great relationship, right? So this is about relationships in community and in government.
Right. Thank you. Heather, please.
I love that question. And yes, I'm totally with you. I think we're still learning sort of what are the frames and the messaging that can help kind of build bridges across these worlds. And I think that the community safety is a big part of that. And, one of the areas of kind of advocacy and strategy here is finding the areas of common ground that are bringing people to the table. So here's a very specific example: clearance rates. We have a crisis of low clearance rates. We also have horrible racial disparities and zip code disparities on sort of the response to the solve rates on violent crime, and the different aspects of that bring people across the violence reduction and criminal legal and racial equity spaces together to think about how we build up partnerships that build trust and legitimacy for the system. And another powerful tool, the Vera Institute of Justice has engaged in a lot of public safety messaging polling. And some of these results, I think, are really powerful and can provide some really effective scripts to help both message to kind of media and public, but also the stakeholder communities of those who are doing this work to come together. And this idea of being serious on safety. And this, as someone who so often, because I care so much about reducing violence, because I care so much about the victims it impacts every day, is why I fight, certain strategies on the criminal justice side that are inequitable or that are not effective, and then get sort of confronted with that we're not serious about safety, and it couldn't be further from the truth. So I thought that was really powerful. And to be really specific and sort of how this has played out in some recent advocacy efforts in Annapolis, there was a bill 2 sessions ago that was sort of championed as this big centerpiece of the gun violence reduction effort to increase prison terms for first-time unlicensed gun possession from 3 to 5 years. Because the people carrying guns in community aren't taking the penalties seriously. And instead of incarcerating them in local jail, we need to send them further away from home to state DOCs so they really feel the penalties and put down the guns. All the while, in plain sight, not addressing the unaddressed trauma and fear about why people were carrying in the first place. The mountain of literature we're sitting on at this point that sending people further from home and disconnecting them from their families is terrible for recidivism, because you send them back, more vulnerable from where they started. The literature on deterrence, that there's a very big difference versus certainty of consequences versus severity of consequences. And we had a ton of laws on the books that if they actually worked more effectively and people had trust in the system and wanted to collaborate on solving crime, would have all the penalties anyone could ever want. And instead, we were wasting time making harsher penalties that would undermine public safety, and repeatedly getting confronted in Annapolis for fighting that bill and trying to invest in strategies that we know work as not being serious on safety. I will give one more example. Crime victim compensation. We've talked a lot at this summit about it. We just passed this huge bill in Maryland to transform this program. I don't think we're talking enough across the criminal legal reform and GVP space around how problematic it is to fund these survivor support benefits with fines and fees levied on the backs of poor families who are over-criminalized and cycling in and out of the system to fund victim compensation benefits. It's not a sustainable source of funding. It's not an equitable source of funding, and it props up this tired, old, problematic false dichotomy between who are victims and survivors and who are people that are being ensnared in the criminal justice system. And it has to change. It is the one piece of our effort in Maryland that we couldn't get done this year, again, because everyone's clinging to revenue sources like, how are we going to fund this if we don't charge poor people for their criminal justice system fines and fees that they're not able to pay anyway. So we got to come together with our budget folks to ground truth the actual math around this, and we got to advocate differently, and we got to do it together.
Thank you for that, Heather. Thank you for the question. Let's go to Jeremy next, and we'll get one more here. Yep.
Thank you, everyone, for wonderful insights. I wanted to talk to you. This is probably directed more at Heather. I want to talk to you about the boogie down later. So, so in my former life, we had helped build the first ever Office of Gun Violence Prevention in New Haven. And we did a series of listening sessions, and we talked to the community. One of the biggest complaints that we had gotten from the communities was there's a giant institution in New Haven, Connecticut, academic institution. We touched on this at the last panel, and they were wondering how we can engage more with those types of big institutions. And I want to applaud you for what you're doing within the law school. Do you have any insights on how we can develop those partnerships better so that they are helping the communities and also actively involved in creating these Office of Gun Violence Preventions?
Yeah, I love this question. Two kind of responses come to mind. One, the way that OVPs can bring together those institutional partners. I mean, we in Maryland just have a wealth of world-class universities like Johns Hopkins. We've got the new Progress Center at University of Maryland. There's so many assets to bring to bear, but I think also while simultaneously recognizing the harm that some of those academic institutions have perpetuated in being not only part of the solution, but sometimes part of the problem. And the way that sort of that ivory tower and the disconnected approach to research has failed to produce the type of information and most importantly in the values-driven way that we're trying to head with this work. So some of you who were here yesterday may have heard Dr. Joe Richardson, one of the heads of the Progress initiative at University of Maryland, talking about their design justice effort to really bring a community participatory approach to their gun violence reduction work. I think leadership like that is so huge for answering this question in terms of different types of academic partnerships. I will also lift up and give a huge shout out to the Black and Brown Research Collective that was just launched to really lift up scholars, Black and Brown scholars, community-focused research, and who gets to be PIs, like who gets to actually get access to the funding to do this work, which for so long has sort of been rigged with a certain set of rules that privilege certain institutions and certain people at those institutions.
And if I can add to that, I agree with everything you were saying and the premise of the question, but this may also be an unpopular view. I think that the universities have an important role to play here too. You know, in Colorado, for example, they have a statewide office, and the University of Colorado is their principal research partner. And that partnership is essential because the office, as we've talked about, is an office of 1 or 2 people. They have a limited budget, much short of what they originally requested, but it's what they got. And if they didn't have that research capacity to be able to, collect data, perhaps evaluate some of the work that they're doing, they would have an impossible job justifying future expenditures or future budget requests in the sort. So I hear everything you're saying, but I guess I'll take the unpopular view to say, like, we also have to find a way to work with these historical research partners or entities, because they have a tremendous wealth of experience in my point of view. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. We'll go here in the middle.
And I absolutely agree with that, Tim.
Hi, my name's Carol Comito. I live here in DC. I work with some women's organizations, and I'm personally trying to work on gun violence prevention within those organizations. First, thank you. I appreciate everything that you're saying. I think I see a problem, and it goes across any kind of organization, anywhere, anything, and that is, and you touched on it, but the word communication. We are not communicating enough, and I know everybody's doing great work, but to the public. I mean, I think if you went out on a street right now, and here's my example that's a pet peeve of mine. The government has an Office of Gun Violence Prevention, the federal government. And if you went out there right now and asked anybody, I think, they don't even know it exists. We all do. It's all part of a bubble. So if anybody has a connection to them, please tell them they need to communicate better. And I just hope that they realize that, because it's important that our government is seen as doing something. And that's really what I wanted to bring forward.
Well, how do you handle that in St. Louis?
Yeah, I mean, you're always going to find, I mean, you can go out, canvas and do all the things, put out literature, hand out literature, and there's always going to be people that don't know. I do think you have to communicate as much as you can continually, not be frustrated by that. I also think you have to produce results. I'll go back to that, right? If you can produce results and then tie yourself to those results, then that helps, right? But the challenge is, because many offices don't have a lot of people, because people are doing this work that's really hard and time consuming, they often don't have, and I can speak about myself for this, right? You don't often think about saying, hey, look at us, we're doing XYZ, we're here. You're just trying to do work. We do something every month called a kickback in the community, every 3rd Saturday of the month. And then we've been doing it since April of last year. And I can tell you, we didn't have any signs or literature around that this is the St. Louis Office of Violence Prevention. We weren't having the DJ announce, hey, thank you for coming to the St. Louis Office of Violence Prevention. Like, because you don't think about that, because I'm just happy that people are showing up, and I see a lot of kids. One park we went to, we were setting up, and the kids are like, what's going on? Oh, we're going to have an event today. And the kids, wow, yeah, we can go play in the park, because they can't normally play in the park. So that's more important to me. I mean, it shouldn't be maybe, but that's more important to me than saying, hey, look at us. We're here. We're doing this great work, right? And so it's a tough balance, but you're right. It does need to be better communication.
We are unfortunately at time. I know we can talk about this for a long time, but we'll be around. A few final things. First, I want to thank our amazing panelists for joining us today. If you could join me in that. Second, if you are interested in learning more about these offices, a few resources I want to flag. We mentioned the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform. They have a network of these offices of violence prevention. Their website, again, National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, has more information about these approaches. Also, our hosts here at the Center for American Progress recently released a report on city-based city offices approaches. And then lastly, I'll just make one more plug for the Joyce Foundation's report on state offices of gun violence prevention. I have a couple of them with me here, if anybody would like one for their plane ride home, or you can find it on our website at joycefdn.org. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to the rest of the conference.